Hi, everyone. We are now in week 6 of the semester. I had thought that by this point in time I would feel a little bit more comfortable being in a room by myself, talking to a camera. The truth is, I wish that we were able to be engaged together in a room, have some good dialogue about the material. I do hope that you're finding the reading interesting. I know there's been some really good conversation going on in the Moodle forums, and I hope as you're getting started in the early phases of your project that you're able to make some connections between what we've been talking about and apply those to real world applications. So this week our topic is thinking like a strategist, thinking like a scientist, thinking like a designer, thinking like a leader. Um, my wife and I have kind of an ongoing joke whenever we see an incident where maybe there was a lack of um, good reasoning, lack of any reasoning. We'll turn to each other and just say, thinking is hard. And it's funny because it's true, right? Thinking is incredibly hard. Um, One of the reasons I think that the template-driven strategic planning that we've been talking about has grown in popularity within organizations is because it looks like it's hard thinking, but it really isn't hard thinking. It kind of bypasses the really not only difficult and hard thinking, but the difficult decisions that go along with that. And so this is, I guess, the reality of being a really effective organizational leader and being someone who leads strategy within an organization is that it is really hard work. It's grueling work. It's not only intellectually difficult, it's emotionally difficult. And so um, we'll build on this throughout the semester, but I wanted to talk just a little bit about some of the things that are in the readings for this week. So Rummelt uses the analogy that strategy is like a scientific process. And so actually what he says is strategy is the hypothesis. The execution of the strategy is an experiment. So think about that. I doubt that you've probably ever thought in those terms that the actions that an organization take are actually an experiment. But I think that mindset is at the core of adaptive strategy. It's important to think about it in terms of the fact that when you do act on strategic initiatives, you're generating a lot of data. You can analyze that data and go back and see if what you predicted would happen actually did happen. And then you can make adjustments. A scientific process and a design process are really circular things that never end. They're ongoing. And I think that's a little bit different mindset than what we've thought about for strategic planning, where we've typically thought of it as a one-time exercise that then generates a plan that lasts for a number of years. And so a big shift in our thinking is that it's an ongoing, continuous, adaptive process. So I'm going to go back to this just a little bit. Whether it's a scientific process or a design process that we're thinking of or using as an analogy, they're very similar. They have three things that in common. One is they all start with an earnest effort to understand how the world works. You have to have a deep understanding about a lot of things before you can make accurate predictions. They both rely on then based on that information you have, making some predictions, and then third, testing whether those predictions are right. And so what is it that we make predictions about as a strategist? So three things. We make predictions about what the world needs, what people need. And I guess when it comes down to it, we make predictions about what people are willing to pay for, whether that's in the form of a product or service that a customer or client is willing to buy, whether it's a service that taxpayers are willing to fund, or that a foundation is willing to fund those types of things. So we need to understand or make predictions about what will people sacrifice for. So I think a good example of this, in maybe the best example over the last couple of decades, is Apple, the Apple company under Steve Jobs. So Apple created products and services that basically completely revolutionized multiple industries. How did they do that? I think it's insightful for us or instructive for us to go in and see how they made those predictions and how they made that innovation work. So Steve Jobs was famous for saying that Apple did not do focus groups. And they didn't do focus groups where they went out and actually asked people what they wanted and needed and then built products and services to meet those needs. What Jobs would have said is that people don't know what they want until you show it to them. So how did they make their predictions? Well, they went much deeper than just simply asking people what they wanted. They went into really deeply understanding pain points, what people, what problems they were trying to solve, what frustrations they had. And then once they understood those pain points, they were able to creatively think about ways to solve those problems. And then they really did do this experimental, version after version, whether it's the iPod or the iPhone or iTunes. They continually learned from the things that worked and built on those, things that didn't work and made those better. So I think that's a really good model to look at for this whole process of adaptive strategy. The other thing that strategists need to make predictions about is human behavior. All of this is about how we behave as humans. So I think it's as a leader and as somebody who's involved in strategy, it's helpful to understand like the most basic things of like, how does the human brain work? How do human beings make decisions? We're learning more and more through research that we're really not very good at making decisions. We certainly don't make a lot of our decisions rationally. Most decisions that humans make are very emotionally driven. What does motivate people? I think we've clung to probably ideas about that for a long time that maybe aren't accurate. That we're getting a clearer picture of again through deeper research about the human brain and how decisions are made. How do human beings? How and why do they create habits and stick with habits? And how, as leaders, can we turn maybe bad habits or habits that are not effective into better habits? The third thing that strategists make predictions about is how organizations should operate. This is sort of taking the individual things that we're talking about, human behavior, and moving them to the collective. So how do those individual mindsets and habits become collective organizational culture? Questions like how do you balance within an organization you're leading, how do you balance the need for control with a need for autonomy among all of your people? What role do values play in organizations? It's something that a lot of leaders feel uncomfortable about and they avoid talking about values. But we need to understand that a lot of decisions are based on values as opposed to, again, rational thinking. What role does structure play and how can that impact how people behave? So this may be the most important thing that I say this semester. I think to be a really good leader and a really effective strategy maker, to borrow an adjective that Steve Jobs often used, I think you have to be insanely curious about these three questions and engage in just ongoing continuous learning to try to understand these things better. One of the things I'll do throughout the rest of the semester is I'll share some of the readings and thinkers in these areas that have helped me. And I certainly know that I have a long way to go in understanding these things, but there's some great resources and books and sites, websites and whatnot that I have found that have helped me develop some of the skills around making better predictions. So one of the other things that Ramel talks about this week is really thinking about the creative side of leadership and strategy. And so really the foundational question is, how do leaders and how do organizations get better at creating more and better insights, basically. One of the things that I've in my career, been in hundreds, maybe thousands of meetings where strategy was being decided, where problems were trying to be solved. And typically those things are done without any sort of a creative process involved. And so as an illustration, I put this point A and point B here. So point A represents a challenge or a problem that comes up in a meeting, for example. Point B is the solution to that problem that we're searching for. What invariably happens without a creative process is that there is a rush to get from point A to point B as quickly as possible with as little emotional and intellectual investment as possible. Straight line. How can we get to the solution quickly? And part of that is, part of it is a time thing, right? We just don't have the time to invest in really deeply thinking about things. Part of it is that emotional thing that we all deal with when we don't have closure. We want closure. When things are out there unresolved, we're uncomfortable about that. So part of being a leader of creative thinking and strategic thinking is you have to be a little bit comfortable with discomfort, and you have to help your teams and the people you're leading be comfortable with that. So I know some of you were in Dr. Renfre's class last spring, her org theory class, where I came and talked a little bit about creativity and leadership. And I talked about the creative process having a shape, not a straight line, but a shape that looks something like this. And so not only does it have a shape, but it has three very distinct parts to it. And those three parts represent three very different types of thinking. And so when I'm facilitating a process with a group, I often draw this picture in advance to create the expectation that, first of all, yes, we will eventually get to point B, and there's going to be some discomfort along the way, but we will get there. And then also to let them see the path a little bit. So this path goes like this. There's the first phase of it is the opening. The middle phase is exploration. The final phase is closure. And so in the opening phase, we are you're gathering information and you're generating ideas. And this, without having this picture in front of a group, they often feel discomfort because it feels like you're moving away from where you're trying to get to. I've heard it often. We're not moving towards the solution. We're moving away from it. Why are we doing that? Well, you're doing that because you're trying to generate fodder for creativity. You're generating information that then can be used in this second phase of exploration, where you are making new connections, connecting dots in ways that have never been connected. That's where you are truly creating and innovating. And that's typically what I find with groups is that when you're doing this, it's fun. It's fun to come up with even better ideas than any one individual could have come up with alone. And then you get back to this third phase of closure, which again introduces some discomfort for people because they've created these great ideas, and now they learn that they have to throw away a lot of those good ideas, and only the very best idea gets to survive. That's really how innovation works. That's really how Apple, I think, has, I haven't been on the inside there, but when you look from the outside, you can see that this is really how that innovative process works. These three phases have three very different types of thinking involved in them. So the opening is a divergent type of thinking, expansive. You're expanding your thinking. The middle is emergent. You're again connecting ideas together. creating new ideas. And then the third phase is this convergence. You're narrowing, you're prioritizing, you're throwing away things that aren't the best ideas. One of the things that I think is important to do as you're working on creative processes, strategic processes, is to try to create some time gap between these. Since they are very different thinking processes, it's hard to transition from one to another without some time in between. And in fact, there's a lot of benefit from taking time in between, because if you work really hard, and for example, in this divergent phase, this opening phase, and generating and brainstorming a lot of good ideas, and then you leave that for a day or two, a lot of insights will come to you in the middle of the night or when you're taking a shower the next morning, and you wonder, where did those come from? Well, they came from the beginning of some really hard thinking, but then your brain, unconsciously or subconsciously, making some connections with information that it already had. And so that's kind of the magic of creativity, but the magic doesn't happen without the hard work of doing the process and the thinking. So that's really, we'll spend more time as we go on in the semester talking about how you do some of these things, how you actually, technique-wise, can get better at generating more ideas, how you can get better at bringing people together to make connections and explore together, and then eventually, obviously, have better ideas at the end of all of that. That's it. I guess the other thing that Rummel talks a little bit this week is not just that the intellectual and mental side of thinking, but also kind of that emotional aspect. That's a hard thing too when you're a leader. Typically as a leader, you're dealing with a lot of difficult pressure situations, especially when you're leading change. A lot of people are impacted by that. There's a lot of resistance to that. Part of being a leader and being a strategist is that demeanor and that mindset, that you're staying calm, that you are, exercising good judgment. You're taking your time to think through things. There's a great quote in the Rummel book that's something to the effect that, it's one of the most difficult things to do is to be an independent thinker and not be the curmudgeon. Basically, how do you challenge people to think differently without being kind of the jerk about that? So that's I think there's some really fun reading this week, some really good ideas that we will build on throughout the rest of the semester. Again, I hope things are going well with your projects starting out, and we will connect again soon. Thank you.